In class today, we ended by looking at this example. This is Mozart's theme and variations on Twinkle Twinkle Little Star. Just as a reminder, here's what this sounds like. And we talked specifically about two different types of intervals. One, we talked about the intervals between each note in the melody. So we talked about the fact that this C to G is a perfect fifth, and then this G to A is a major second, and so on and so forth. We did the same thing with the bottom voice. But the most important thing we discussed were the intervals between the voices. So the harmonic intervals that exist here. So again, we said there was octaves in the first measure, and then we have E to G, which is a minor third, then C to G, which is a perfect fifth, so on and so forth throughout the rest of the first couple of measures here. This is all to get us ready for what's known as counterpoint. This is the setting of two independent melodies against each other. And there are a system of rules that govern what intervals can be used, when they can be used, and then how to resolve certain special intervals that may come up as you are working on these exercises. So let's take a look at another example, a little simpler. This time, we're in the key of A flat major. Notice it's a little bit shorter example. There aren't any repeated notes in the upper voice. Let's take a listen to what this example sounds like. So as you can see, we're basically using the same intervals that Mozart was using. We're just using them in a different order. And presenting them a little bit differently. One thing you'll notice here is I'm not indicating with my interval numbers what quality the intervals are, except in the case of the diminished fifth. That's because in this style that we're learning, we're only going to be composing things in major keys to begin with, and both major sixth and minor sixth and major thirds and minor thirds are allowed in the style. So we really don't care whether it's major or minor. So just identifying the interval as a third here between A flat and C is all you need to do. Also, we can pay attention to the types of motion between the voices. So for instance, notice that A flat moves down to G. At the same time, the bass A flat moves up to B flat. So these voices are moving what's called contrary motion. One is moving down while the other is moving up. Other types of motion we can have, notice G in the next bar moves to A flat, and then this B flat moves to C. So these are both moving up by a step. So we call that motion parallel motion. They're both moving up by the same amount. And then notice for the rest of the examples here, we can be described as either contrary or parallel. In this case, these motions are in opposite directions, one up, one down, so that's contrary. Then we do contrary in the other direction. The upper voice moves down, bottom voice moves up. Then we have parallel motion, moving down by a third melodically, moving down by a third melodically. Parallel, then more contrary motion between these voices, then contrary again, and then finally ending with more contrary motion. The reason there is so much contrary motion is because it just works very well in this style. Let's listen to this example again. In this style, we're restricted as to what intervals we can use in any given time. Now, I mentioned we can use major or minor sixth or major or minor thirds. Well, we're also able to use octaves and perfect fifths at our discretion. Perfect fourths, believe it or not, even though we classified those as a perfect consonants, are considered extremely dissonant in this style. There are historical reasons for why this is so that we can get into at a later time, but for right now, avoid writing perfect fourths in your counterpoint. But perfect fifths and perfect octaves are perfectly allowed. Also notice what intervals are not here. Notice there are no major or minor seconds, there's no major seventh, and there's no augmented fifth. Right? The diminished fifth is here, and we'll talk about its resolution in a minute. But those are the intervals that are not allowed in this style whatsoever. We'll never ever use those intervals in this style. Notice our allowed intervals are all consonant intervals. But we are going to allow 3 special dissonances that, if they are used, require a specific resolution. One of them is in this example here, and it's our diminished fifth. Our diminished fifth resolves in what's called a contraction. In this case, notice it's contrary motion into the resolution, simply moving the bottom voice up by step and the top voice down by step. The resulting interval will always be a third. Also, this interval works particularly well with scale degree 7, or T, as your bass note, with the diminished fifth written above it, which means scale degree 4, Fa, is going to be in your upper voice. This interval works particularly well when those scale degrees are used to create your diminished fifth and then the resolution to a third. Very similar to the diminished fifth, we can have its inversion, the augmented fourth. So as I've done in this example, I've simply moved the G and the D flat and had them switch places. Now the D flat's on the bottom and the G's on top. But notice the resolution of the individual notes is the same. The G is still resolving up to the A flat, while the D flat is still resolving down to the C. But notice that results in the interval of a sixth in the resolution. So the proper resolution of an augmented fourth is to expand. The top voice moves up by step, and the bottom voice moves down by step. Here's what this sounds like. The last of the special dissonances you'll be allowed to use is a minor seventh. Notice I've made a small change to the last 2 notes in each line here at the end of our example. The minor seventh can be used, again, this is a minor seventh, not a major seventh. The minor seventh is best used with scale degree 5 in the bass, in this case E flat, and that's paired with scale degree 4 in the upper voice. Notice how this resolves. It's also resolving to a third, just like our diminished fifth did, but it does it in a very different way. The bottom voice of the minor seventh will resolve either down by fifth, like this has here, or it could resolve up by fourth. Notice that's always going to result in the same note. So in this case, if E flat resolved up by a fourth, it would land on A flat. And if E flat, as it does here, resolves down by the interval of a perfect fifth, it also lands on an A flat. The upper voice will simply move down by step, always. So in this case, that results in the motion from D flat to C, and then E flat to A flat. Let me play this entire example again so you can hear the different ending. So those are the special dissonances we can use: the diminished fifth, the augmented fourth, and the minor seventh. Getting back to types of motion between the voices for a minute, while parallel and contrary and something called similar motion, which again we'll talk about in class next time, are perfectly allowed, certain types of parallel motion are absolutely forbidden. Notice I've changed the beginning of this example to show that both voices start on A flat, and then both voices move in parallel motion to B flat. This is what we call parallel octaves, and these are not allowed. Here's what this sounds like. And so on and so forth. We don't allow parallel octaves. We will never allow parallel octaves. Parallel octaves between voices will always, even when we get into part writing later, will always be forbidden. Along with parallel octaves, we also don't allow parallel fifths. So if you have fifths between voices which then move to another pair of fifths, this is a problem and should be avoided at all costs. So this has been a quick introduction to what's known as first species counterpoint, or note against note. So that means whatever note we have in one voice, we pair that with a single note in the other voice. We'll learn more about this style over the coming weeks, including adding what's known as second species to the mix. One quick final thought about melodic voicing. Notice the melody here is not just picked arbitrarily. In addition to fitting in our allowed intervals, including our special dissonant intervals, I've also been very careful to do and take care with good melodic writing. And some basic things you can think about to help with your melodic writing are fairly simple things that will help your counterpoint sound just a lot better. One, notice that every time I have a large leap or a skip, anything that isn't stepwise in the melody, the next motion in that voice is to turn around and go in a step in the opposite direction. And every time I have a leap, I turn around and step in the opposite direction, especially here in the upper voice. Notice the same thing happens in the bottom voice too. A leap down and then a step up. A leap down. Here there might be the one exception where there's a leap down, but then there is a step up at the end of that. Try to avoid multiple leaps in a row if possible. Other things to avoid are if you are in minor, you have the possibility of writing a melodic augmented second. That means you're writing a melody that goes from 6, which in minor would be lay, or that flat 6, going to your raised scale degree 7, T. That interval creates an augmented second, and we want to avoid that in a melodic sense as much as possible. Also, avoid writing direct tritones inside a melody. Tritones, or diminished fifth and augmented fourth, are perfectly fine as harmonic intervals as long as they're resolved correctly, but we do want to avoid them melodically at all times.